This week, Paul and I discuss DevOps versus DevSecOps. In the news, text editors could become the next breach vector. GitHub detects over 4 million vulnerabilities across 500,000 repositories. And Google will reward developers for patching open source software. Stay tuned for all that and more on this episode of Application Security Weekly.
This is a Security Weekly production. Today's determined attackers easily bypass even the most advanced network defenses. Trying to ramp up staff to detect their backdoors can cost thousands of dollars and take months, even years. With Active Countermeasures AI Hunter, we enable junior analysts to detect even the most advanced backdoors in a matter of hours. Sign up for a demo and purchase our product today by visiting activecountermeasures.com/ASW. Active Countermeasures. Make every analyst a hunter. IT Pro TV, binge-worthy learning for IT teams. Why is it binge-worthy? It's learning presented in an engaging and entertaining talk show format that beats voice-over PowerPoint snooze fests. Watch over 3,300 hours of content in their on-demand library on your desktop, on the go, or in the comfort of your own living room. IT Pro TV is IT training you and your team actually want to watch, which means a better return on your learning investment. Get started with IT Pro TV for teams by visiting itpro.tv/Security Weekly and start a 7-day free trial and get 30% off standard or premium IT Pro TV memberships using the code SECWeekly30.
Welcome, everyone, to episode 10, our 11th episode of Application Security Weekly. I am, of course, your host, Keith Hoodlet, and I'm excited to be joined by my illustrious co-host, Paul Asadorian. Paul.
Thank you very much, Keith. Wonderful to be here talking all things application security. You've got some great content, some of which I've got some experience with, actually, which is awesome. So I'm excited.
I will say for those listening live, feel free to go and check out the wiki. And for those that listen to the podcast later, you'll find that everything is coming up sevens. Like this is a winning episode, as it were. So, Paul, before we get into the main topic for today, though, just a couple of quick announcements. Go to itpro.tv/Security Weekly and use the code SECWeekly30 to try a free 7-day trial and receive 30% off your monthly membership for the lifetime of your active subscription. Personally, I've been using IT Pro TV for a couple of classes related to Vue.js from the development side, but I know that they do a number of great sets of content on the security side as well, and I think that all of our listeners really could benefit from that. The other announcement that I wanted to cover for this segment is to check out Source Boston 2018, which is May 9th to the 10th. Go to sourceconference.com and register using the code WMKW. So that's Security Weekly 75 Whiskey Mike Kilo Whiskey to get a $75 discount. With that, Paul, DevOps versus DevSecOps. I think last night on Paul Security Weekly we discussed this a little bit. And you and I are both in line, but DevSecOps has been a term that's been thrown around more recently by security vendors and those that are trying to inject themselves into the DevOps process. And I find it a little weird, personally, because I think that DevOps somewhat covers that already. But to get started, Paul, what are your thoughts on the whole idea or like the clash between DevOps and DevSecOps?
I think the one of the major points and benefits of using a DevOps process is the blending of code and infrastructure into the process, so they're treated equally and the same. And once you do that, you can apply security to that process. I still believe it's still DevOps. If you're doing a DevOps process, you have to be adding in security as well as other kinds of checks into your process and constantly pushing forward. So I don't think we need a separate term for DevSecOps because, to me, if you understand DevOps, security and infrastructure and IT and development are really just all one process. And if you even extrapolate that out further, it's all a business process. And every business process has to include some types of checks and balances for integrity, for security, which are obviously related, So I don't believe that DevSecOps is a thing. I think that DevOps is a process that allows you to apply security controls more easily and in an automated fashion. And that is
And
still, to me, DevOps.
I agree. And in fact, I go back specifically. I've been rereading the DevOps handbook after recently rereading the Phoenix Project,
Hmm.
based on you. Obviously, you have recently finished that as well from the audiobooks. But there are a couple of things that are highlighted at the very beginning of the DevOps handbook. First talks about value stream mapping, which is value to the organization. And they call that the sequence of activities required to design, produce, and deliver a good or service to a customer, including the dual flows of information and material. The interesting thing that comes about when they talk about value streams, though, is shortly thereafter they say the value stream begins when an engineer in our value stream, which includes development, QA, IT, operations, and InfoSec,
Hmm.
checks a change into version control and ends when that change is successfully running in production, providing value to the customer and generating useful feedback and telemetry. So I think that what that tells us right away is if you're not including security as part of your DevOps process, you're not doing DevOps because to this end, it's part of the value stream. So if you failed to deliver a secure product and you have to go back and patch it, then your deliverable time is everywhere from you've initially launched it to when you've actually gone back and patched it.
Hmm.
So to that end, I agree with you, Paul. I think that DevSecOps is probably a term that someone at a marketing organization or marketing team within a security company said, "Why don't we add security into the middle of this DevOps thing?" And suddenly it gets some more highlighted feedback to everyone that we talk to on the development team. And it makes me wonder if developers and CIOs are looking at the DevSecOps thing and rolling their eyes. Maybe I wouldn't know, but I was actually having a good discussion earlier this week with Rich Mogul, as well as Daniel Miessler from IO Active on Twitter. And we were talking about the DevSecOps versus DevOps. And there was kind of the back and forth of, can you do DevOps without including security? And Paul, I'd be interested to get your thoughts there because I think that to some degree, you could still be doing DevOps if you're not including security. Say you're a startup and you don't have a security team, but at some point you have to include security. And I would like to know what you think about that.
Well, I think the larger question is how you apply security to this process. And certainly one of the things that I'm starting with is in our DevOps process, how do we automatically check for known vulnerabilities? And this is an easy thing. This is the scanning component. I think it is a pretty easy thing to implement it into your environment. There are commercial tools that are available from our sponsor, for example, Layered Insight and many others in this vein. And there are open source alternatives. I'm actually embarking on a project that I'll be testing both and making recommendations for our audience. Say maybe you try it first in open source, and then when you grow a little more, if you're a startup, then you look at more commercial tools that offer a much deeper insights and deeper protection from security. So the scanning is just one component. In other words, when I check in a container, I know Docker does some scanning already, but there are also open source tools that will do a deeper level of checking. I forget the name of the project, but I'm looking into a couple of them. They're actually pretty new. And this one also, the one I'm looking at, includes ClamAV. So it knows if there's any kind of malware inside of your container. And I think that's important. And then once you have that DevOps process, certainly a separate process, as we've seen from other vendors, such as WhiteSource, Black Duck, Flexera made an acquisition. They will, as you're working with the code, right, scan libraries that you're including and incorporating in your code. So since DevOps is this continual process, we can more easily now integrate some of these features. That means as a developer, when I am checking in code, I can say the system tells me basically you're including a library that has a vulnerability. It's an open source library and it has this vulnerability, and you should upgrade to a later version to make sure it doesn't. So in the development process, I'm applying security. I don't see why you wouldn't do that, right? If you can make that work in your process, you should do that. Then once you get to the container level and you've built the infrastructure required for that piece of your application, there are processes that check to make sure there's no vulnerable components inside of those. And then you push to QA. Inside of your QA process, you're checking not just regression testing, functional testing, but also there's some security testing that should be built into that process as well. Maybe some kind of, if it's a web application, some kind of dynamic scanner that automatically runs and automatically feeds those results down to your developers. And then once you're in production, then security becomes different. It's more of a how is it integrated in my environment? How is it doing the monitoring and giving me, I hate to use the term real time, but feedback and protection for my application at runtime. And so, all of those things for me are just part of the DevOps process. You don't, it speaks to integrity, right, of the application.
Right. And to that end, it's interesting because you mentioned a lot of things that, for the most part, unless you're using the tools as part of the process to give yourself visibility, you have no idea whether or not you are vulnerable to begin with. And you need to actually implement that as part of the process, because in DevOps, you track two time frames associated with your build process. There is lead time, which includes when the ticket is created, when the work is actually started, and when the work is completed. And then there's process time, which is between when work started and work completed. So ideally, what you're trying to do is you're trying to get work started to work completed to be the smallest functional set of time that you can complete things in, but also, of course, trying to cut back on too many things coming in from a ticket creation standpoint. So you're focusing on the work that you're actually trying to complete. I would argue that when work is completed is when it has made it through that entire pipeline appropriately and securely, right? If you're not adding security functionality, whether it's unit tests, integration tests, fuzzing, dynamic application scanning, if you're not doing static analysis either at the development time or after initial check-in, like you're not doing DevOps at that point. You're maybe doing some sort of I don't know, half-life version of DevOps where you're not including all the right steps in the way through.
I think it speaks to how
DevOps.
You need to break up your work in DevOps into the smallest chunks possible. And so if you're checking for all these things every time you're making commits, and a small number of tickets are being created on every run, and you're fixing those and then going to the next run, that's way better because you're working in smaller chunks. You can get more done, is essentially the lessons from, that we've learned from some of the resources we talked about. Now, in the older model, we would, make a release, and then somewhere in the process, in some release, we'd say, oh, we need to do some security testing. Security would come in and find a laundry list of vulnerabilities that are associated with the code, they're associated with the platform, maybe they're associated with the logic in the application, and those things take a long time to fix all at once. Now you're tying up a significant amount of resources. It's almost like unplanned work that's generated from every once in a while security audit. And getting away from that helps security so much, because now if you do have, and I encourage as part of your security process, you do want a third party to look at your application. In fact, we just talked about a bug bounty program, right? You want third parties of some kind to look at your application. But if you've applied all these security in smaller chunks as you're releasing multiple times a day, they're only going to find, hopefully, they'll find less items that you can more easily integrate back into your environment and have a quicker turnaround, because now I'm not getting hit with, I've got a logic error, I've got a function that has, from static code, has known to have vulnerabilities, and I've got some infrastructure, maybe my application server's out of date, and I'm using a vulnerable library. Now I got to make all those changes all at once, regression test the whole thing, and it's more error prone. Whereas if the first time I commit, the system tells me you've got a library that's vulnerable, and then so you make another commit, you fix that right away. That's faster and more efficient, in my opinion, and why security should just be, it's just baked into the process like we've always talked about, and now I feel like it's actually possible if you're implementing DevOps.
And especially if you're doing things like, making secure configurations. And as a security team, especially for the security practitioners that are listening, you're probably looking at this and saying, there's no way we could do all of that. And moreover, if we did, it would cost us a ton of money. And I would actually say, quite frankly, especially if you hire really good application security professionals, you can build your own internal tooling, whether it's, small functional libraries for password storage or password aggregation, so that you're doing that securely. The secure ways to set up and connect to the database. There are things that security professionals today can do to actually augment your development team's work by providing them with internally built, code, whether it's a function or what have you, that does things securely, or even if it's not internally built, finding one that is a hardened standard, and then of course applying that as use this library going forward for this type of work, and just kind of being somewhat prescriptive about that. So to the extent that in my mind, work is not completed until the application is secure. And then the unplanned work, which is maybe, as we talked about on Enterprise Security Weekly earlier this week, security teams should plan to build in time for unplanned work. And that is when you actually have something in production that is found to be vulnerable because of a new exploit or a new vulnerability that is
Right.
now making it into the wild. So that's a situation where you now you can iterate through a DevOps process again
Hmm.
by identifying that and quickly yourselves making the changes that need to take place to upgrade and push that back through the build pipeline again to then be deployed out to production accordingly. So one of the things that you mentioned earlier, and I think it's also important as part of this process, is having small batch sizes is what they end up calling it in the DevOps handbook. And to that end, the analogy that I like to use when it comes to batch sizing is sending out a series of letters. So my brother-in-law is getting married later this year, and so my wife is the maid of honor or matron of honor in this case, and she is sending out invitations for their Jack and Jill party and what have you. And so one of the things that I recently did as part of helping her with that mailer is small batch sizes. We printed one letter. We made sure everything was good in that letter. We folded it appropriately and then put it into the envelope and sent it. And the reason that a small batch size there is important is if we had printed out 30 letters and realized we had a typo or the address was wrong or the date or time was wrong or what have you, we'd have to go back and print 30 more. But then also, even if we had everything correct on the letter, but then we folded them all and then they didn't fit in the envelope the way we wanted them to, we'd have to go back and fold all of them again. So the DevOps process is print one letter, confirm that it's good, fold that letter, confirm that it fits in the envelope, check the address on the envelope itself, and then send it. And essentially that's like the push to production. It's check in your code and make sure that it has no bugs from a static code analysis
Right.
perspective. And then compile your code or prepare your code to be containerized, whether that's Docker or Kubernetes or something else, and make sure that it actually functions appropriately with unit and integration tests inside of the container. And then put that into an ecosystem where it's now talking with other containers inside of kind of a microservices framework or network, right? And if it does and everything is still good, then push it out to production because now it's made it all the way through QA. And hopefully, as part of that QA process, you're doing fuzzing, you're doing dynamic application scanning, and you're doing everything else that's kind of, post hoc, as it were. But to that end, I think that in my mind, you and I, Paul, both agree DevOps is the right term. If somebody says DevSecOps to you, try not to roll your eyes,
Mm.
but also make sure you correct them because I think we both agree DevOps includes the processes, is inherent with security as part of it.
Agreed.
Awesome. You heard it here first, folks. DevSecOps is a lie. It's just DevOps. We know we do have a few minutes here for this segment. I do want to cover several of the learning and tools items that I put together this week. I think it's going to please probably just about everybody. The first one is actually a link out to a browser plugin called Refined GitHub. And what it allows you to do is when you go ahead and create a new issue ticket, for example, it will allow you to do things like marking it as unread. When you go ahead and create an issue ticket, it might recommend something to you that is similar. So it's like, I think the issue ticket that you're creating is related to this other already open ticket. And so what it allows you to do is it actually hopefully will prevent issue ticket creation from stepping on one another and then having to go back and close out repeated issue tickets, which I thought was really awesome. Paul, are you using anything like GitHub or GitLab internally for the development that you're doing at the Security Weekly team?
Yeah, we're using GitHub. Currently, the ticketing system is a different system from GitHub today. But yeah, we use GitHub and any tools to make that process easier for people. And really, any system that we use is welcomed. So that's pretty awesome.
Yeah. The other one that I wanted to recommend here is a project that actually I believe Shay Chen was on Security Weekly, the main podcast, about a year and a half ago, if I'm not mistaken, which is a project that rates the quality of dynamic application scanning tools. And he's recently released a new version of kind of his rating system. And Shay is entirely a third party. He doesn't accept funding or any sort of sponsorship by any of the companies that he's testing against because he wants to be a objective third party here.
I can
But he runs through.
I can validate that for Shay. He's been on the show, and I've actually worked with him when I was evaluating web application scanners. I had some conversations with Shay and talked about how he is very much separate. I've actually talked to a number of web application security companies that all know Shay very well and participate and help him have that unbiased opinion. And he does work with the vendors, and it's funny how they are very, very like walking on eggshells when they talk about Shay, because it's like the one person you don't want to piss off.
Right.
Because he is very much an independent source of evaluations for primarily dynamic web application scanners. And I've used his WAVSEP framework. So he built essentially a web application that he uses to test all of the other products. And I've actually used WAVSEP to conduct my own experiments on evaluating the various features and functionality and effectiveness of web application scanners. So if you're doing that, it is an awesome way to test these various products.
What I really liked about this in his latest iteration of the WAVSET project is he actually breaks down everything versus paid or open source. So if you're looking for an open source dynamic application scanning tool that can meet some of your needs, and if it's open source, why not use multiple, right? You have the opportunity to actually look for coverage within that project as well. That is going to be link number 1 under learning and tools, because in this case, I think that for those that are looking to adopt quality scanning tools that perhaps won't cost them much, if anything at all, including things like Burp Suite Pro, I should mention, as kind of that augmented scanning tool. He includes it there, which is awesome. The other one, and this is actually related to what we were just talking about, Paul, is there's number 2 under learning and tools is a project called Change Me. And this is a default credential scanner that will go ahead and check against default credentials for the systems that you're using to produce your web application. So maybe you've got default login credentials to, I don't know, a WordPress admin panel, for example. And so in this case, it's an opportunity for you to augment part of your processes for checking for vulnerabilities before things get pushed to production by first checking for default credentials, because let's face it, that happens a lot. And Paul, you've recently been switching over some of your WordPress instances using a new tool as well that is paid. But I don't know if you do any sort of default credential checking before you've pushed things over. So tell the audience more about what you're currently doing with your WordPress instances, because I think it's probably valuable to some of our listeners.
Sure. I've always felt that checking for default credentials is one thing that organizations don't do enough of, and there was certainly a lack of tools that are available today to do that. So I'm very happy to see this project. It's definitely something I'd like to implement. With the WordPress, it's interesting. It kind of made me realize, like, when you think of the DevOps process, you immediately go to like Docker or AWS to implement your DevOps process. And when we've run WordPress for some time, I understand there's a lot of security issues with WordPress. It makes it kind of an interesting environment to secure and use. The functionality that you get out of WordPress, I think, is awesome. It's very easy to roll out new functionality, which is also why it tends to be a lot less secure, because everyone's adding new functionality and it's not getting the quality and security checks that it needs to. So my initial thinking was, well, I'll build environments myself. And when I researched it, I'm like, wow, this is like a complete nightmare. Like the engineering behind so we've got 3 WordPress properties. Each one would need a development, a QA, and a production, and you'd have to build an easy way to push your containers out into all of that. So you'd have to, in my case, I would have to implement some type of Kubernetes orchestration system. After I've done the engineering and architecture to get WordPress to run inside of containers, I was like, well, that's a lot of work, and there really wasn't much reference happening. There wasn't a lot of resources available to help me build this. And someone mentioned the WP Engine could be a potential solution. What I found was what I thought was an open source project I'm like, well, that would be great. I can just use it and implement it. Turns out it's not. It's a paid service. But cost-wise, I believe it's actually going to save us money and give us more functionality. So what WP Engine allows you to do is you get a number of sites depending on the plan you choose. Each site comes with 3 sites. So for each of my 3 sites, I have created now a dev, a QA, and a production, and they give you a seamless way to move through them. They add some other enhancements that they do for you, such as content caching, content delivery networks, and some security controls as well. You can also password protect your like non-public instances if you want, so that people aren't breaking into your dev and QA as you're testing things. And I'm like, wow, I can implement. This can become part of my DevOps process. Now, I haven't looked into the API, which I'm sure exists. And again, I'm just starting to get a hold of it. But there are buttons that basically say, okay, copy QA to production, and just clone it. And I'm like, that's awesome. That's exactly what I need. Even if at the beginning it's a manual process, it's still now being integrated into our DevOps process. Even though we're not using Docker or AWS for WordPress, we're using another service, which so far, so good. I'm only about a day into it, maybe 24 hours. But I'm liking what I'm seeing so far. And it's a tool that allows us to incorporate WordPress now into our DevOps environment so that when we're doing a development run of our software, which links into our WordPress instance, we can test all that in dev. So if we've made changes in WordPress and we've made changes to code, we can push all that to dev. We can do some basic unit testing. Then we can push both to QA, and those environments are linked. Then we can run automated tests to make sure it works. And then once it does, we push both environments out to production because changes in either system could affect each other. And so now I'm like, well, this is great. I didn't have to build all of this stuff, which I wanted to, but like the amount of engineering time that would take up was, in my opinion, too great. So.
And to that end as well, the nice thing that it will get you here is if there's the API calls that will allow you to automate this process, right? So someone
Yes.
pushes code into GitHub that will then work through a Jenkins pipeline that then calls out to WP Engine and does all of that work for you. So that actually will make things really, really smooth. And I know it's funny because we've talked about this, I think, a number of times, before the show or after the show. And I can tell that you've done your homework on it, which is also really awesome because if you're saying that, look, I'm trying it now, actually like bought it and trying it, that generally tells me enough that, if I'm running a WordPress instance, I should probably check it out at this point because I know you well enough, Paul, that you wouldn't just jump right into something if it wasn't worth actually trying to do and trying to achieve. So I look forward to future episodes where you tell us how that went. If the wiki goes down, now our listeners will know why.
Yes,
But with
yes.
that
Yeah, we're
being
actually
said,
looking to put everything on the WordPress platform and move away from the wiki. And there's engineering going on to make that happen. What I really like and what I found with WordPress is if you don't keep your plugins up to date, if you don't keep your theme up to date, and you don't keep the WordPress engine up to date, someone's gonna break into your site essentially. And so because in even just those 3 areas, there's a lot of change that can basically either introduce a vulnerability or introduce some kind of instability. I was like, I really just wanted Docker because I wanted to go make all those changes in development. And if it worked, I had no good way to copy my infrastructure and my config over to the next environment. And they provided exactly that. So I can do all the things I need to do in WordPress. I can update the theme, which can cause huge issues, but also have security exposures. I can do that in dev now. And if it doesn't work, I can revert back very easily. It's kind of like working with snapshots in VMware, right? Except it's an entire WordPress environment. And I think you absolutely need that to have a prayer of keeping WordPress secure. Because carrying over config and other changes, and like we were making modifications where we'd modify a page and I want to incorporate a bunch of new elements in there, and I might need to install a new plugin, and then you're doing that in production, and then you've got a production copy of the page and you got another copy of the page, and what if there's a security vulnerability in your other copy? It was just a nightmare. So I want to push environments through a chain, and it let me do that very easily. So I like it.
or worse. I mean, I know that it was several episodes ago at this point, but we actually covered when WordPress ended up auto updating itself out of having an auto update.
Yes,
Knowing that
yes.
that's there and just being able to roll that back easy,
Mm-hmm.
that's going to save you a ton of time. So with that, I do want to just mention a couple other items. I'm not going to like cover them, but Under learning and tools, we also included under number 3, the OWASP Vulnerable Web Applications Directory project. So if you're looking to teach yourself some AppSec, go check that out. There's a number of other tools that we've included. But with that, stay tuned. We are going to go ahead and cut to a break and then come back for the news.